Chapter 39 The Battle of Ravenloft. Rowan went for the neck, and so did Strahd. The two wolves snarled viciously as each grabbed at the other's throat, but neither could get a firm grip, and they pulled away. A crossbow bolt flew past as Davian rushed into the room. The wolves leaped at each other again, rolling, growling, snapping, each trying to gain the upper hand. After another exchange, Rowan tore away and stepped back. They circled one another. A bolt shot again, this time smashing against a magical shield that appeared around the black wolf. Strahd did not even take his eyes from Rowan.
"You are pathetic," Strahd said. "Weak. I am ashamed to think I once considered you as my successor."
But Rowan heard the frustration behind his words. She was holding her own, and it galled him. Dodging around Rowan's jaws, Strahd sank his teeth into her flank, causing her to yelp. Rowan tucked in her tail and tried to kick him off with her hind leg. She whipped around to snap at his neck, but only managed to catch a mouthful of fur on his shoulder. Biting down hard, Strahd shook the white wolf like a rag doll and pinned her under his paw. Davian's bowstring twanged, and Strahd's magical shield glowed as another bolt glanced off. It was just enough to distract him. Rowan broke free and jumped to her feet.
"I grow tired of this," Strahd said.
Suddenly, she did not understand why she was fighting Strahd. Rowan sat down on her hindquarters and watched the vampire shift into his human form. Then Strahd lifted his hands, and dark shadows rippled across the floor toward her. He turned away and started crawling up the wall like a spider. When he reached the ceiling, he crawled right through it and vanished. Davian squawked, pointing to where Strahd had disappeared.
"Quick, Rowan! We need to follow him. He's probably going after Irina and Navara."
Rowan could not fathom why the bird was so agitated. Instead, she turned her attention to the shadows. Davian screeched and ran off down a corridor toward the upper levels. The shadows were stalking her from every corner of the room. They rose from the ground in dark, sinister shapes, without faces or substance. Rowan could not tell if they even had bodies. She transformed back into an elf, but before she could lift her spear to dispel them with fire, one of the shadows grabbed her with an icy hand and threw her to the ground. Navara ran down the spiral stairs, past the door to her old room. She ran to the next floor and stopped at the landing by the dining room. That's when she heard someone coming up the stairs toward her. "Davian," she said, when the were-raven, in his human form, scrambled into view. "Where's Rowan? Is she with you?"
"Watch out!"
Davian cried. He was looking past Navara into the open dining room. The were-raven drew his sword. Navara turned around to see Strahd, clad in armor, standing in front of the decaying green cake.
"There you are, you sly fox," Strahd said, walking toward her. "What have you done with Irina?"
Before Navara had time to say anything, Davian rushed at the vampire. Strahd drew his sword and easily brushed the attack aside. Davian was thrown against a wall.
"Sicking an old man on me now?" Strahd said. "I find that quite insulting."
He raised his sword and was about to bring it down on Davian's head when Navara screamed, "No!" She blasted Strahd's hand, her magic tearing a hole through his flesh. Strahd grimaced. He stared at his hand, shocked by the sight of his own blood. It was the first time Navara had seen him injured.
"What have you done?"
he cried. The magic of the crystal heart had been undone, but Strahd was still a vampire. His wound began slowly knitting itself back together. "Strahd, please, there doesn't need to be a fight," Navara said.
"Oh, my love," he chided in a cynical tone. "It is far too late for that."
Davian was back on his feet and slashing at the vampire with his sword. Strahd's movement was casual as he parried the blade with his own and sent the old man crashing into a dining chair. Navara gripped the talisman of St. Markovia in her palm and extended it toward the vampire. But when she tried to paralyze him, it felt as though her magic had run up against a brick wall. Strahd's force of will was stronger than any she had felt before. Her outstretched arm began to shake. "I see you found Markovia's old trinket," Strahd said. He put a hand on his chin and cracked his neck. "She tried to stop me with it too, with about as much success." Then he cast a spell on Navara. The room grew large around her, and bunny ears sprouted from her head. "Not again," she moaned, as she hopped toward Davian on 4 fluffy feet. Suddenly, light flooded in from one of the doorways, and Strahd squinted his eyes. Henry barged into the dining room and set upon Strahd with his sword. Apollo's light burned the vampire's face, causing his skin to sizzle. Irina arrived right behind Henry. Both of them were drenched in blood. Wielding a halberd, Irina stabbed at Strahd, but only managed to scrape his armor. The Count scowled as he gave ground before this new onslaught, all the while blocking and parrying. Davian joined the battle, hacking wildly with his sword, but Strahd turned the blade so it smashed against the dining table. Dust and bits of porcelain flew everywhere, and a red rabbit hopped out from under a chair. Another of Henry's thrusts met with nothing but air as Strahd ducked aside and scurried up the wall. Now the vampire was standing upside down on the ceiling, walking as though it were no different than the floor. His hand began to move in a pattern like he was casting a spell. Henry leaped onto the table to reach him, smashing plates and kicking silverware. With Apollo's radiant blade flying toward him, Strahd put both hands on the hilt of his sword to parry the blow. Hopefully his spell had been interrupted. The fight continued down the length of the table, with one duelist above and the other below. Henry was pressing the action, lunging, striking, feinting, and redoubling again. He trampled the old wedding cake underfoot. Its crusty green icing peeled away to reveal that the sponge underneath had turned to dust long ago. This was the first time Henry had crossed blades with Strahd, and he recognized the swordsmanship of a master. Strahd's form was perfect. Even fighting upside down, his every movement was crisp and precise. Wherever Henry struck, the vampire's sword arrived just a split second before his own, almost as though Strahd were reading his mind. Actually, Henry thought, that might be exactly what he's doing. Strahd gave a knowing smile as he continued shuffling backward along the ceiling and turned aside another stroke of Apollo's blade. Henry gritted his teeth. Though Strahd's hands and face were blistering from the light, he was completely composed. He seemed to be defending himself, with no effort whatsoever. Then Strahd weaved his hand again and cast a spell. At once, a thick mist filled the room. With Apollo's sunlight reflecting off the fog, everything was white, and Henry could see no more than 2 feet in front of his face. He pressed forward, searching for the vampire with his blade, until he almost fell off the end of the table. As Henry tried to catch his balance, something whooshed past his head. He lashed out with Apollo, but hit nothing. Abruptly, Henry felt a sharp jab under his arm as a sword point punched through the chainmail. He spun around and tucked in his shield to protect himself. A deep laughter echoed through the mist. It sounded as though it were coming from everywhere all at once. The sword struck Henry again, this time sweeping his legs out from under him. He crashed onto the table. Still the sword kept striking him, over and over, each time finding another gap in his armor. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped, and all was silent. Henry was doubled over in a ball, panting. He heard a rustling sound, and then, bang! A door slammed shut. Bang! Bang! 2 more doors. "Where is he?" asked Irina's voice. Without warning, the white fog changed to a sickly yellow. Irina and Davian began coughing. When Henry inhaled, he felt a burning in his lungs, and his eyes watered. The mist was poison. He gagged as the noxious cloud engulfed the entire room. Henry rolled off the table, his wounded arm limp at his side. Gasping and choking, he pushed himself along the wall until he came to a door. It was locked. He heard another door handle rattling on the far side of the room, and Davian called out in a raspy voice, "We're trapped!" In the throne room, a shadow tightened its cold grip around Rowan's chest. A second and third shadow pressed in on top of her until she was enveloped in darkness. Rowan struggled, feeling her life being drained away from the inside out. It could not end like this. She refused to be overcome. Groping around on the stone floor, she found her spear. Then she called upon the spirit of the moon and muttered an incantation. At once, a bright moonbeam shone in a circle around her, and all the darkness vanished. Rowan staggered to her feet. Where did those shadow monsters come from? She thought. Obviously, the dark powers were trying to prevent her and her friends from breaking the curse. The forces of evil would do anything to stop them. But why had Davian left her to chase after Strahd? Had Henry and Irina kissed at the heart? She needed to find them. Rowan departed the throne room and followed the path Davian had taken up a spiral staircase. When she reached the first landing, she heard sounds of labored breathing coming from behind a door. "Davian?" Rowan asked. The response was a fit of hacking and feeble cries for help. "Stand back!" Rowan yelled, pointing her spear at the door. She cast a spell, and it was burst open by a blast of water. A thick yellow mist spilled out of the room. Rowan conjured a gust of wind to clear the air, and the mist dissipated, revealing 3 people gasping on the ground. Rowan ran to Irina first. Her thin dress was caked in drying blood. Irina coughed. "I'll be fine. I just need to catch my breath." "Henry's hurt," Davian said, crawling beside the knight. "I'll be all right." Henry laid a hand on his own wounds, and his body glowed. "Where's Navara?" Rowan asked. "She's here," Davian said, holding a wheezing rabbit. "Again?" Rowan asked. She gently picked up the small animal and cast a spell. The rabbit transformed into an elf. Navara thanked Rowan through fits of coughing. "Quick!" Henry said, and held out Apollo. "We need to find him." "He went that way," Davian said, pointing to the western door. "I felt him brush past me right before the doors locked." Davian, Henry, Irina, and Navara were still hacking up great masses of bloody phlegm. "What happened?" Rowan asked them. "Is it the dark powers attacking us?" "What the fuck are you talking about?" Henry said. "It was the same damn vampire we came here to kill." "You mean Strahd?" Rowan asked. "Why would he harm us? He wants the curse to be broken as much as we do." Irina looked Rowan in the eyes. "I think you're charmed." "I'll take care of that," Navara said, and waved a hand over Rowan's head. All of Rowan's affable feelings toward Strahd dispersed like the fog. She frowned in displeasure. After coming to her senses, she pointed her spear at the western doors and blasted them open with another jet of water. Henry was the first to run through the doorway. The others followed, coming into a large bathroom. Here they found a red-haired servant girl hiding behind the tub. "Navara, thank goodness you're here," the girl said. "Helga, are you all right?" Navara asked, approaching her and checking her for injuries. The girl nodded. "Which way did Strahd go?" Navara asked. The frightened girl hugged Navara. "I don't know. It all happened so fast." "It's all right," Navara said, comforting her. "Just tell us what you saw and—" "Hey, let go! What are you doing? Let go!" Navara struggled to keep hold of the talisman as Helga's strong grip twisted her wrist and tried to pry it from her grasp. "Let go," Henry commanded, leveling Apollo at the girl's throat. Her skin began to blister under the light. Navara's brow turned up in anguish. "I'm sorry, Navara," Helga said, "but my master wants this." "There he is!" Rowan shouted. She had opened a set of double doors to reveal Strahd waiting for them in the bedroom beyond. He grinned. There was now no sign that he had ever been burned on his hands or face. He beckoned to them, then stepped back and faded through a wall. "Shit!" Henry said. With one thrust, he cut Helga down. Then he ran after Strahd. Irina and Davian followed behind Henry, but Navara stopped to look at the slain vampire spawn. "Come on!" Rowan urged the warlock, then ran into the bedroom. "He's outside," Henry said, looking out a large arched window. Rowan kicked the window open and the glass shattered. Then she stepped out of the opening and onto the battlements below. Strahd was standing at the parapet, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky. Hundreds of black wraiths circled high above as a baleful wind howled through the castle turrets. Rowan focused her attention on Strahd. She cast fire, but he flicked his hand, and her flames rebounded off a blue shield that appeared around him. Rowan cursed. As soon as the shield spell dropped, Davian let fly with his crossbow. The bolt clacked harmlessly against Strahd's armor. Navara came up beside Rowan and lifted the talisman toward the vampire. Rain poured down on her face as it twisted in concentration. She screamed with the effort. "Give it up, Navara," Strahd said, sauntering along the battlements, unaffected by the talisman's magic. Henry charged, but Strahd flew up into the air before Apollo could make contact. "Fight me, damn you!" Henry shouted. Then he unfurled his wings and took off after the vampire. Fire, crossbow bolts, and green streaks of magic hurled through the air at Strahd, but none of them found their mark. He was too quick. The sky flashed with lightning, and Strahd dove low over their heads, cloak whipping behind him like bat's wings. Then he was away, past Henry, climbing into the sky. Rowan transformed into a giant owl, pausing briefly to let Irina climb onto her back. Davian turned into his hybrid form. Navara cast a flying spell. Together they flew into the rain and chased after Strahd, soaring over walls, under bridges, and around towers. Their futile attempts to strike him only made him laugh. Rolling as he flew, Strahd aimed a finger at his pursuers. A mote of red light shot out and exploded all around them in a ball of fire. The shock wave sent them tumbling. Rowan faltered, nearly spinning out of control as she tried to steady herself without losing her rider. She dropped many feet before finally pulling up. By some miracle, Irina still clung to her back. Rowan's wings were a bit scorched, but the rain had kept them from catching fire. Far below, she could see that Henry, Navara, and Davian had fallen onto the domed roof of the chapel. It was hard to tell if they were all right. "There he is!" Irina cried. Strahd was climbing through a window in the high tower. Rowan was torn. Her friends might be dead or dying, but she could not let Strahd get away. Steeling her mind, she gave chase. Rain pelted her eyes as she sped to the tower. As soon as she came to the window, she transformed into an elf, alighting on the stone floor inside. Irina landed behind her. The raging tempest outside illuminated the room with intermittent flashes of lightning, but Strahd was nowhere to be seen. The walls were pierced by windows, and cobwebs draped the lattice of old rafters overhead. At the center of the floor, a shaft like a well dropped away into blackness. Cold air rushed up from out of the shaft, making Rowan shiver. A strange squeaking noise was coming from below. She had seen this place in her dreams. As she started inching toward the dark hole, Strahd appeared as if from nowhere. His sword was already mid-swing. Instinctively, Rowan jumped back and blocked it with her spear. Irina rushed to help her. Soon the top of the high tower was all a melee of clashing blades and flashing spells. Jumping to avoid a blast of fire, Rowan slipped. Now she teetered at the edge of the shaft, waving her hands wildly as she looked down into its bottomless void. The flat of a sword caught her before she fell. "Do not lose your balance," said a haughty voice. Lightning flashed, and Rowan saw Strahd with his sword outstretched, protecting her from falling. "That would have been an unpleasant experience," he said. Rowan stepped back and scowled, shoving his blade away. Irina swung at him with her halberd, but Strahd caught the weapon's handle. "You know, Irina," he said, "we might have to forego our wedding plans and turn you now. You will be so much more cooperative." Then he tugged on the halberd and pulled Irina into his arms. "No!" Rowan yelled, as Irina struggled in the vampire's grasp. Rowan lifted her spear and called on the power of the sun. She had never been able to summon its light before, but she knew her other spells stood little chance of stopping Strahd. She had tried them all. Shouting the incantation with rage and desperation, she could feel the Morning Lord's fiery rays coursing through her body. A blast of sunlight erupted from the spear point, engulfing the vampire in a radiant blaze of blinding light. Strahd shrieked and threw himself against the wall. His skin was catching fire. Irina slid from between his arms, shielding her eyes. Rowan's spear trembled in her hands, and drops of sweat beaded on her brow. The weapon's head was glowing red-hot. Strahd tried to cover himself with a shield spell, but the flaring sunlight smashed the barrier as soon as it was cast. The vampire's flesh was melting away. He was screaming in agony. Just when Rowan thought she had him, Strahd flung himself from a window, and her concentration on the spell broke. Rowan ran to the windowsill. Strahd was plummeting to the ground, but galloping through the storm was a flaming steed. It swooped under its master and caught him as he fell. Rowan slammed her fist, cursing as the nightmare carried Strahd to safety. "Irina, stay here," she said. Turning again into a giant owl, she flew out of the tower. If Strahd escaped, he would heal, and all her efforts would be for nothing. From the corner of her eye, she saw 3 figures rising through the air as well, flying at Strahd. It was Navara, Henry, and Davian. Hope swelled in Rowan's chest to see that her friends were still alive and still giving chase. When Henry had almost intercepted the Count, a column of fire blasted across the sky. Henry lifted his shield to protect himself from the flames. A deafening roar, many times louder than a vampire's, ripped the air like a peal of thunder. A moment later, Rowan saw it. Scaleless, skinless, without muscle or sinew, the skeleton of Argynvost clung to the side of the North Tower, lashing out with the very head that they had restored. Rowan's heart sank as the dragon breathed fire again. Henry tumbled in the air, avoiding the flames by a wing feather. Navara and Davian dispersed, each flying in a different direction. Strahd was gone, borne away by his nightmare. "Shit!" Henry thought to Apollo. He had almost forgotten about the dragon. The enormous beast rattled its bony wings as it took to the sky. "How does a thing like that even fly?" "Magic, yo," Apollo said. "Right, smartass. How do we slay a dead dragon?" Henry lifted his shield as the dragon belched forth yet another jet of fire. But this time a surge of water doused the flames before it reached him. Rowan had turned back into an elf, and a tidal wave was pouring from the tip of her spear. Without wings to hold her aloft, she was plunging downward. But before she fell too far, feathers sprouted, and she soared upward as an owl once more. The dragon blew fire again, and Rowan repeated the maneuver, transforming mid-air, casting water, and transforming again. The skeletal beast roared and swiped its claws at the owl. Rowan darted this way and that, but the dragon's jaws were almost upon her. The skull opened its mouth, either to bite or blow fire, when Davian flitted around the dragon's eyes, stabbing at the empty sockets with his sword. The dragon shook its head like a horse trying to rid itself of a pesky fly. Taking advantage of this distraction, Henry dove in close and struck at the dragon's back. Apollo cracked one of the skeleton's vertebrae, angering the beast even further. The dragon swatted Davian with its massive claws, knocking him from the sky. At the last moment, right as the were-raven's limp body was about to crash on the castle walls, Rowan dove down and caught him in her talons. Then she swooped away from the dragon's grasp. Meanwhile, Navara had been blasting away at the bones with her eldritch magic. Aside from a few cracks, there was not much to show for her effort. "What does it take to kill this thing?" Henry asked Apollo, while dodging the bony wings. "Do we have to chop up all its bones?" "I find chopping the head usually kills most things," Apollo said. "You ever killed a dragon skeleton before?" "Nope." Henry flew toward the dragon's head, but each time he got close, one of its mighty claws lashed out to crush him. Just as he veered away again, a flash of green magic struck the arm that was reaching for him. It shattered at the wrist. Navara blasted again, breaking the entire arm from its body. The dragon's angry cry boomed out above the storm. As it wheeled its head to snap at the warlock, Henry landed on the nape of its neck. With all the force he could muster, he plunged Apollo through the top of the dragon's skull. The keen blade burst its head open. Bone splintered in every direction, and light poured forth from its gaping maw. For one moment, all the bones of Argynvost hovered in the sky. Then they dropped with the rain, smashing on the roof and courtyard below. "I pray to God we never have to put those bones back together," Henry said to Apollo. Then he flew with Navara to the high tower, where Rowan had taken Davian. Inside the tower's turret, Irina sat by a deep shaft, holding the old crow's head. Davian was still in his hybrid form. "He's dying," Irina said when she saw Henry. Henry brushed back his wet hair and knelt beside the were-raven. He laid his hands on the black feathered chest, and light began to glow. Davian gasped. He groaned, sighed, then transformed into a man and looked up at Irina with tired eyes. "Take this," Davian said, handing Irina the small bottle of healing potion he had gotten from Muriel. "I am too old to keep going. You finish this. All of you." He looked around at the others. "And when it's done, come back for me if I'm still here. Don't worry, I'll do my best to stay alive. You do the same." "We will," Henry said. "We need to find where Strahd went," Rowan said. She was holding her left arm as though in pain. "I almost had him, but he's probably healed himself by now." Speaking of healing, Henry laid his hand on Rowan's arm, feeling a broken bone underneath. He did the best he could, but knew he did not have the strength to mend it completely. Then he turned to Irina and Navara. The warlock had a few burns that looked painful, but not too serious. "I'm sorry," Henry said, after trying to heal Navara. The burns were still there. "I would do more if I could, but my magic, it's weakening." "It's all right," Navara said. "I'll be okay. We're all a bit battered and worn out." Henry wondered if they should even go on. Could they defeat Strahd with what little they had left? But when he looked out a window and saw the legion of wraiths descending upon the high tower, he knew there was only one way out of this. "We have to kill him," Henry said, "or die trying." "Then let's go." Irina stood up. "Come on, there's a staircase leading down." "Wait, I see him," Navara said, holding her bracelet. She was staring at the tower's stone wall, but there was an image reflected in her eyes. A caped man walking into a room full of bones. "You're scrying on him?" Henry asked. "Yes, and I know where he is." Her eyes changed back to normal, and she ran to the window. "Don't tell me we have to go back out there," Henry said, watching her face. "This tower doesn't lead to the part of the dungeon where we need to go," she said. "We have to fly to the north tower." The wraiths were drawing nearer. Henry took a deep breath. "All right, let's do it." Then he jumped out the window. Navara flew through the sky, blasting away any wraith that got too close. In front of her, Henry and Apollo soared like a white beacon, cutting through the darkness to the north tower. Irina, flying on Rowan's back, sliced a wraith with her halberd. The creature hissed. Navara blasted it, and the wraith exploded in a puff of smoke. Close on their tails, a host of wraiths were sailing toward them like an oncoming storm. One by one, the wraiths fell upon them like the first drops of rain before a deluge. With Navara covering their retreat, they made it to the north tower and swooped down the central stair shaft. Blood still covered the tower's walls from where the crystal heart had exploded. They plunged downward. The wraiths were not far behind. "Navara, get to the front!" Henry shouted. She needed to show them the way. When they landed on the ground floor, they found themselves in an empty hall with strange mosaics on the floor. Navara ran past Henry, heading for a smaller staircase that continued to descend. Henry waved Apollo like a torch to drive back the wraiths. Their wispy bodies undulated over his head, some skirting around the sunlight to attack Rowan or Irina. Rowan, now an elf again, raised her spear and shouted a spell. A pillar of sunlight flared up the tower, obliterating every wraith it touched. Rowan's entire body glowed with the power she wielded. "Go!" Henry shouted to Navara, who had stopped in amazement at the dazzling light. They ran across the room, but as they reached the top of the stairs, Rowan's sunlight faded. Navara looked over her shoulder and watched as the druid collapsed to the floor. "Rowan!" Navara shouted. More wraiths were beginning to pour down the tower. "I've got her!" Irina yelled, and hoisted Rowan across her shoulders. "Go!" They ran down the stairs, with Henry guarding their rear. Remembering the way Strahd had taken her, Navara sprinted past the old soldiers' quarters with rotting cots, past the chamberlain's office, past the hall with rusted suits of armor, until she saw an open door on her left and ran into the Hall of Bones. Once the others were in, Navara slammed the door shut. Cries like the braying of angry horses came from the wraiths on the other side, but the noise soon died away. "Are they gone?" Irina asked when all was quiet. Someone clapped from the other end of the hall. "Bravo!" said a cavalier voice. Sitting with his feet propped on the long table of yellowing bones was Strahd. He was as handsome as ever, without a scratch or blemish to be seen. "Come, give up your futile quest to kill me. I promise I will be lenient if you throw in the towel now." "Fuck you! We'll never surrender," Henry said, raising his sword. "Henry, such language. What would Mother say?" "Rowan," Irina whispered to the unconscious druid on her back. "We need you." But Rowan did not respond. This was Strahd's plan all along, to wear them down until they had nothing left to fight him. Strahd got up and strode toward them. But Navarra noticed something in his stride that was not quite right. "Lay down your weapons now. I won't ask again." There was also something different in his voice, and yet familiar. Navarra's eyes widened. "Where's the real Strahd?" she demanded. "What do you mean?" Strahd asked. "You can't fool me, Escher," Navarra said. "I've seen you give this performance before." The vampire let a smile slip onto his face. "What can I say?" His accent changed, but not his disguise. "I enjoy taking on this role, though I should have known you'd figure it out." A rattling noise began stirring throughout the room, and suddenly the walls, the columns, and the ceiling began to move. Bones clacked along the floor, then stacked on top of each other to form whole skeletons. A group of them crawled off the wall and attacked Henry. The knight smashed through them, trying to reach Escher. "Escher, where is he?" Navarra pleaded. "I saw him come down here. Where did he go?" "I'm sorry, darling, but you know I can't go against the master's orders." Then he drew his sword and blocked Apollo as Henry struck. A mass of skeletons climbed on top of each other and rolled out like a wave from the table. Navarra flared her fingers and blasted holes in the gathering horde. She blasted again and again as the surge of bones crashed in around her. The skeletons swallowed her up, tearing at her dress and scratching at her arms. Just then, a gust of heat blew past Navarra's face as red flames broke through the swarm. Rowan was standing with her spear raised and an empty vial of health potion at her feet. The druid cast fire again, slicing away another troop of skeletons. Yet still more continued to emerge on every side. "We need to get out," Irina shouted, lifting her halberd. "This way!" But as soon as she ran to an open doorway, the real Strahd appeared beside her. He grinned, then snatched Irina and dragged her out of the hall, slamming the door shut behind him. "No!" Henry cried, running to the door. He yanked on the handle, but it was locked. Suddenly, all the other doors in the Hall of Bones bolted themselves shut, trapping Navarra, Henry, and Rowan inside. Irina was alone with Strahd. Henry threw himself at Escher with a crazed scream. Apollo was a blur of flying steel and blazing sunlight. Though the vampire tried to exchange blow for blow, he was no match for the knight. Henry stabbed him through the gut. Escher's eyes bulged, and he transformed back into himself, his purple vest now stained red with blood. Henry withdrew his blade, and Escher staggered for a moment, then fell to the floor. Navarra ran to the vampire and held his hand. "You can't save me, Navarra," Escher rasped. Navarra's eyes welled with tears. "I'll bring your body back home to your sister. I promise." "Thank you. And, Navarra, say a prayer for me." I will, she sniffed. She did not notice that the hole in his belly was beginning to heal, until Rowan leaped upon him and drove a stake through his heart. "Get your head in the game," the druid fumed. "Navarra!" Henry yelled, whacking a skeleton. "Teleport! Go after Irina!" Knowing that Irina was in greater danger than Henry or Rowan, Navarra teleported. She appeared in a wide hallway on the other side of the door. Now the only noises came from the fight in the locked room behind her. In the middle of the passageway, Irina lay motionless on the floor. "I knew you would be the first to escape," Strahd said, looming over Irina's body. Then he turned to Navarra. She held out the talisman and strained against his iron will with all her might. "Ah, Navarra," Strahd said, "if only you had trained as my warlock, you could have understood such magic." His footsteps echoed as he walked toward her. "In a few moments, Rowan is going to shapeshift into some small animal and come crawling under that door. Then, who knows,
Maybe Henry will join us if he's not torn apart by skeletons.
As soon as he finished speaking, a small white bat squeezed through the crack under the doors. In one motion, Rowan transformed into an elf and began casting a spell, but Strahd was ready. His quick fingers glided through the air, snuffing out Rowan's spell before it could be cast. Navara tried to use the talisman again, but it was like pushing against a mountain. Rowan charged at Strahd with her spear. All it took was a flick of his wrist to throw the druid back until her body slammed against the wall. In that moment, Henry burst through the door, and a pile of bones flooded into the hallway. He barred the door, then turned to face Strahd. "You never learn, do you?" Strahd said, arcing his hand. He cast a wall of force around Henry and Rowan. It formed as a translucent dome, trapping both of them inside. Henry and Rowan pounded on the magical barrier, cursing at Strahd, shouting for Navara and Irina, but they could not get out. Navara looked at the body on the floor, realizing that the next time Irina moved, it would be as a vampire spawn. Strahd approached. Navara did not bother to fight or flee. There was no way out. This was the end. Strahd relaxed his hand, but the dome remained in place. "You were right, Navara," he said, running his fingers through her hair. "I put my hope in the wrong woman. Irina may never marry me. But you, there is still hope for us." Navara looked at Rowan, who was pounding relentlessly on the magical wall like a frantic animal. But when Rowan noticed Navara's gaze and read the look in her eyes, she slowly stopped pounding, her face giving way to a numb, vacant expression. Then Navara saw Henry, the chosen one. He was screaming from behind the dome, his face contorted and wet with fresh tears, but his voice was fading into the distance, as though he were many miles away. Here, in this dungeon, there was only herself and the Lord of Barovia.
"No, Strahd," Navara said. "It's too late for us. I've already given my heart to another."
Strahd's upper lip twitched. "Your heart belongs to me."
Instead of kissing her or caressing her gently, as he had often done in the past, Strahd held her like a vice and sank his fangs deep into her flesh. Then he drank. No, Navara thought, her life ebbing away. She and Irina would be his undead slaves for all of eternity.
"This isn't how it's meant to be. Because... I love you,"
Navara said. Strahd stopped drinking, but his fangs were still embedded in her skin.
"Read my thoughts," she whispered. "You'll know it to be true. But if you turn me into one of your spawn, you will lose me. I'll cease being Navara, and you know it. And every time you look into my empty eyes, you'll see only death. All the real love I had for you will be gone. Day after day, you'll know you killed the only person who cared, and it will drive you mad."
She felt his body tighten against hers. Still, he did not drink. In the corner of her eye, she saw flashes of light as Henry continued his vain attempts to break free. Navara wanted to keep talking. She wanted to calm Strahd's spirit, to make him see reason. But he could kill her even now, and he would certainly kill her friends. She could not hesitate any longer.
"I do love you,"
Navara said to him.
"But this has to end."
She channeled magic through the talisman and overpowered him in an instant. Strahd froze, paralyzed. Navara broke free from his unyielding grip, and the wall of force vanished. Henry and Rowan charged forward to attack. The world before Navara's eyes felt surreal, and everything slowed around her. Strahd, still conscious but unable to move, stared at Navara in disbelief. The shock of betrayal was written in his eyes. Nivara clasped her hands to her mouth in horror at what she had just done. A spell flew past her, and Rowan's fire consumed the vampire like an igniting torch, sending angry flames licking up around his face. Strahd was unable to even wince at the pain. Then came the avenging angel. Henry brought Apollo down upon Strahd's head, cleaving it from crown to jaw. Before Strahd had time to bleed, his body evaporated into mist.
"There he goes!"
Rowan shouted. The mist disappeared through a crack in the wall.
"We need to go after him! Nivara! Nivara!"
Nivara was shaken from her stupor.
"Here, you're bleeding."
Rowan tore a piece of cloth from the bottom of her shirt and pressed it to Nivara's neck. Nivara held the cloth and turned to Irina, who was sitting up with Henry by her side.
"Irina, you're alive!"
Nivara cheered.
"Did Strahd bite you?"
"No," Irina said, rubbing her head.
"He just knocked me out."
"You scared the shit out of me," Henry said. "Both of you." He looked from Irina to Nivara, then back to Irina. "When I saw you lying there, I thought...
"I suppose we're even now, Gibson,"
Irina said. "Come here." Henry pulled her into a hug. "I wouldn't have been able to heal you if you had..." But he did not finish his thoughts out loud.
"This is very touching," Rowan said, "but we need to find Strahd's coffin now, before he rises from the dead." "How do we get there?" Irina asked.
"Victor told us his tomb is on the south side of the catacombs," Henry answered.
"Victor?"
Irina asked. Henry gave her a look that told her they would explain later.
"But our good friend Victor didn't show us how to get to the catacombs," Rowan said in frustration. "Does Apollo know?"
Irina asked. Henry shook his head.
"I know a way,"
Nivara said. Henry panted as he, Rowan, and Irina ran after the warlock, back through the Hall of Bones, plowing through more skeletons that tried to drag them down. Nivara led them to the left, through a set of doors opposite from the way they had come earlier. They ran through a short hallway and up a flight of narrow stairs to the next floor. Henry brushed cobwebs away with his shield, running through a dark corridor until they came to a room full of mirrors. Nivara pulled a hidden handle on the stone wall, and a secret passage opened, bringing them into the great hall where they had suffered through a miserable dinner so many nights ago. The large pipe organ closed behind them. As they ran past the dining table, swords flew off the walls and began to attack them. The castle was coming alive, and it was defending its master. Henry cursed and knocked the swords away. They ran through the grand entryway, the place where Vasily had revealed himself. Then they sprinted down a long hallway lined with stone statues of knights. The statues also came to life and tried to stop them. It took time to cut their way through with magic and sword, but eventually they managed to escape. Henry grabbed at a stitch in his side as they came to a dimly lit chapel, probably the very chapel where Sergei and Tatiana's wedding had been interrupted by murder.
"Damn it!"
Nivara said. She stopped at the verge of a downward spiral staircase, guarded by two statues of prancing cavaliers. The statues were motionless, but beyond them, about 10 feet down from the top step, was a brick wall.
"This wasn't here before,"
Nivara said, slamming her hand on the brick.
"Strahd must have had this built after I left."
"There must be another way down," Rowan said.
"None that I know of."
"Well, we have to do something," Irina said, looking around the room for an answer.
"Strahd could wake up any minute."
"We don't have time for this shit," Henry said. Then he grabbed a broken bench from the chapel and rammed it into the wall. Irina grabbed the other side of it to help him. Meanwhile, Nivara and Rowan blasted the wall with magic, chipping away at the brickwork. After much cursing and sweating, they finally broke through. One by one, they slipped through the hole in the wall and descended the stairs. At the bottom of the staircase, a vast chamber greeted them, with a cold, damp stench. A forest of huge square columns was supporting a low ceiling of interconnecting barrel vaults. The rows of columns faded back into the vast darkness beyond, and each stone column was etched with a different name. "These are crypts," Henry said, running his hand along one of the inscriptions. "This must be the catacombs."
"The south end is this way," Navara said, jogging to the right.
"Are you sure?" Henry asked. But they did not have time to debate. Henry and the others followed after her. The floor squished underfoot as they ran. "What in the nine hells?" Henry looked down. "Shit!"
"What?"
Irina asked. "Batshit," Henry said. As if triggered by Apollo's light, the ceiling came down on them, as thousands of bats attacked in a pell-mell of screeching, scratching, and biting. "Get to Strahd's tomb!" Henry shouted. They all tried to run, but the blood-sucking creatures surrounded them in a swarm of wings and tiny teeth. They pelted Henry's armor and tore at his face. He tried to cover his shield over Irina, whose thin dress did nothing to protect her, but he could not find her in the churning chaos. Henry lost all sense of direction. He thought they would never escape. Then another sound filled the air, a cacophony of cawing crows. A storm of black ravens flew into the catacombs, tearing through the bats. And appearing out of the storm was a man with a sword in his hand and a lute on his back. The ravens consumed the bats, ripping their small bodies apart with sharp beaks and claws. After a short time, the confusion subsided as the bats fled and the ravens pursued. The man with the lute remained behind.
"Elvir,"
Navara said. Rowan turned to the bard.
"Davian told us you weren't coming."
Elvir nodded. "I'm glad I did. I found my father at the top of the tower. He told me to find you." "Better late than never," Henry said. "Come on, we need to hurry." "Where's the devil?" Elvir asked as they ran. "Hopefully in his coffin if we're not too late," Henry said, passing crypt after crypt, until he saw an alcove with an iron gate in the south wall.
"There it is!" Navara cried. "Victor said Strahd's crypt was behind that gate."
She ran toward it, but before she came within 20 feet, she vanished. In her place stood a gaunt man, glowing white. The creature turned on them and drew a sword from its ancient scabbard. "Navara?" Henry asked in horror, not knowing what magic could turn his friend into this monster.
"You dare to come here?"
the creature said.
"It is not permitted that the living should disturb the home of the dead."
Then the creature attacked Rowan. "You have to be shitting me," Henry said. They did not have time for this insanity. "It's a wight," Elvir shouted. "A what?" Henry asked. The bard stepped forward to help Rowan, and as he did, he vanished. Another wight stood in his place.
"What the hell?"
Irina shouted as the two wights lunged at them. Henry defended with his shield, but could not bring himself to strike the creatures. Were they really his friends? He sidestepped to block an oncoming attack, when suddenly everything went black. A third wight took Henry's spot, and Rowan cursed under her breath. Her arms shook from exhaustion as she parried the blades of each monster. What had happened to the others? None of these creatures looked like her friends. What was a wight? Then Rowan saw a faint mark on the floor that looked like a teleportation circle. It must be a trap, Rowan thought. A trap guarding Strahd's tomb. Henry's eyes were open, but he only saw blackness. He was lying on his back in a confined space that smelled of rotting meat. He pushed on a large plank of wood above him, and it gave way.
"Who's there?"
Navara's voice asked. Henry lifted Apollo, and the light illuminated a cave with more than a dozen coffins. Navara and Elvir ran up to him.
We've been teleported somehow to this crypt,
Navara said. Henry stepped out of the coffin in which he found himself. I think we've exchanged places with the occupants of this crypt, Elvir said. Each of these coffins probably holds a wight.
What the fuck is a wight? Henry asked.
They're life-eaters, Elvir replied. All that remains of hateful men consumed by the spirits of...
Forget I asked, Henry yelled. There's no time. We need to get out of here.
Look!
Navara pointed up at a shaft above their heads. Henry spread his wings and flew up until he could grab hold of a ladder at the top. Then he pushed open a trap door. He emerged from one of the square columns in the catacombs. Movement caught his eye, and he thought he saw someone who looked like Victor walking into one of the crypts. Henry almost called out to him, but he needed to stay focused. Enough distractions. Henry sprinted. He sprinted straight toward the sounds of fighting. He thought he heard Elvir and Navara behind him, but he never turned around to see. He needed to get to Strahd. Near the iron gate, Irina and Rowan were fending off 3 wights, but Henry did not stop. He pulled out the wooden stake from his belt and ran for the tomb, yelling, "The gate! Open the gate!" A green streak of magic hurled past his shoulder from behind, blasting the iron bars, and the gate swung open.
"Henry!" Rowan shouted. "Watch out for the floor!"
She pointed to a stone slab, and Henry leaped over it, darting past the open gate, down the marble steps, and into the large room where a single, shiny black coffin lay open. Strahd was resting inside, his eyes closed and his hands folded, holding his sword to his chest. A thin cut on his forehead was just closing. With all the strength he had left, Henry plunged his wooden stake into the vampire's heart. Strahd's eyes flashed open, but the stake held him in his coffin.
"You're finished, you bastard," Henry said.
The sounds of fighting faded as Navara, Elvir, Rowan, and Irina killed off the 3 wights. Worn and weary, they came into the tomb and circled around Strahd's prostrate form. All except Elvir, who guarded the door.
"You lose,"
Henry said, staring Strahd in the eyes.
"You think you are so clever for besting me,"
Strahd said. His head moved ever so slightly. They all took a step back from the coffin, but the rest of Strahd's body remained paralyzed.
"I will haunt you, Henry Gibson, every waking hour of the day, and every night when you struggle to find sleep. I will be there."
"You can't let it go, can you?" Henry said, shaking his head.
"Even now as you lie dying, you try to threaten me. But you don't have any power over me. You never did. Evil will always lose in the end."
"So you think yourself good?" Strahd spat. "Darkness dwells in the heart of every man, even yours. You are guided by rage and vengeance, just as I was. In the end, it will eat you alive. You think you are Irina's savior, but you will never be good enough for her."
"That's true," Henry said. "I know I'm not good enough. That's exactly why I need Irina. We need each other. If one of us stumbles in the darkness, the other will be there to show the way back to the light. But you know nothing of forgiveness or love. You say there is darkness within every man, but then you use it as an excuse to commit evil rather than a reason to be humble. That's why you have the blackest heart of all. You can hate me all you want from the depths of hell, but it won't be me you're haunting. Your hatred of me will be the fires of your own torment." Rowan heard footsteps on the marble stairs and turned to see Esmeralda. Esmeralda stopped and stared in amazement.
"Damn, you've got him pegged!"
"Where were you?" Elvir asked.
"Fucking wraiths and skeletons," she said, walking across the floor. "Nasty buggers were everywhere. But you—"
She went up to Rowan and Henry and slapped them firmly on their backs. You fucking did it! Well done! I'm bloody gobsmacked! You all must be floating on clouds. I think... Esmeralda stopped, looking around the room and sensing the mood for the first time. I've, interrupted something, haven't I? Celebrations can wait. I'll just let you all finish whatever you were doing and... Shut up, Navara said. Just shut up! Right. Esmeralda swung her hands by her side and backed up the stairs. Elvia, don't let anyone else in, Navara ordered. Rowan turned her attention back to Strahd and saw what she might have become. He lay stoically in the narrow coffin, which was lined with red satin and sprinkled with grave dirt. You tried to take everything from me, Rowan said. You turned my father. You forced him to kill my mother. Then you exiled him from his own country, and he turned his anger against me. I was weak when I returned, frightened of the darkness inside me. I was tempted by the same darkness as you, but I succeeded where you failed. All the ordeals and miseries you inflicted on me since I came back to Barovia, they only made me stronger. You hardened my skills, you hardened my resolve, but you could never harden my heart. And now I will restore the land which you stole, and my people will thrive once again. You always put the blame on others for making you what you are. Maybe fate was unkind to you, but you have no one to blame for the tragedy of your long and wretched life except yourself. You doomed yourself, Strahd, and for that I pity you. A single tear flowed down Strahd's cheek. In that moment, a look of remorse crossed his face. Then his pained gaze shifted from Irina to Navara, resting his eyes on the latter. Navara, he said, his voice weak. I think, if I ever did love someone, it was you. Tears came unbidden to Navara's weary eyes. Slowly, she bent down into the coffin, getting close enough that her lips brushed his ear. She whispered so only he could hear. A part of my heart will be buried with you forever. She lifted her head, and a tear fell from her lashes onto his cheek. Then she pressed her warm lips to his cold ones for one last kiss. As she drew back, he said quietly, I want your face to be the last thing I see in this world. From that moment, Strahd never took his eyes from Navara, nor she from him. The others were talking and moving about, but Navara noticed none of it. Henry handed Apollo to Irina. She took the sword, lifting it over the vampire. Sunlight burned his skin, but he did not flinch, accepting his fate. The young woman's steely visage betrayed no pity for the monster who had hunted her for so long. Die, you piece of shit! Without hesitation, Irina drove the blade into Strahd's throat. Navara watched as Strahd's eyes turned from blood red to deep brown. Even the fangs that had bitten so many retracted until there was no sign that he had ever been a vampire. Strahd von Zarevich was dead.